It was the summer of 2016, and the world had no idea who XXXTentacion was. He was not on the radio. He was not on television. He had no manager, no record label, no publicist, no team. He was 17 years old, locked inside a cell at Indian River County Jail in Florida, facing charges that could send him away for years. He had no guitar, no studio equipment, no producer on speed dial. He had nothing except a phone, a pair of earbuds, and an idea that refused to leave him alone, no matter how many nights passed in that cell. Most teenagers in that situation would have given up. Most people, regardless of age, would have looked at those four walls and concluded that the dream was over, that the music was over, that the future was over. But XXXTentacion was not most people. He never had been. And what he was about to do in secret inside that jail, in a single 17-minute recording session with the most basic equipment imaginable, would eventually shake the entire music industry to its foundation. To understand what happened in that cell in 2016, you have to understand where XXXTentacion came from. He was born José Dwayne Ricardo Onfroy on January 23, 1998, in Plantation, Florida. His childhood was not gentle. His mother, Cleopatra, struggled to provide stability. There were long stretches where she was not present, and young José was passed between family members, growing up in the kind of uncertainty that either breaks a child or forges something fierce inside them. For José, it forged something fierce. He discovered music early, not as a hobby, not as something to pass the time, but as the only language that could hold everything he was feeling. When he was around 6 years old, he heard gospel music at a church and was overwhelmed by something he could not name. He started singing, not because anyone told him to, not because he thought it would make him famous, but because the sound coming out of his own chest was the only thing that made the noise inside his head go quiet. By the time he was a teenager, he was recording on whatever he could find. Phones, laptops, cheap microphones, borrowed equipment. He did not have access to professional studios. He did not have mentors in the industry pulling him along. What he had was an obsessive drive and an ear that was already years ahead of everything around him. He was absorbing everything simultaneously. Kurt Cobain, Marilyn Manson, Kendrick Lamar, Ski Mask the Slump God. He was not trying to sound like any of them. He was trying to figure out what lived in the space between all of them, that raw emotional place where genre meant nothing and feeling meant everything. He got into trouble multiple times. The details of his legal history are complicated and contested, and the charges against him were serious. But what matters for this particular story is that by 2016, XXXTentacion found himself locked up in Indian River County Jail, cut off from the world, with no clear timeline for when he would get out. He was still a teenager. He was still nobody in the eyes of the music industry, and he was sitting in a cell with songs still pouring out of his head with nowhere to go. The song that would change everything was called Look at Me. It had started forming in his mind weeks before he was locked up. The concept was simple on the surface, aggressive, raw, confrontational. It was not trying to be subtle. It was not trying to be polished. It was the musical equivalent of standing in the middle of a crowded room and screaming until the walls shook. But underneath that aggression was something more layered. There was pain in it. There was the specific pain of a young man who had been looked past his entire life, dismissed, underestimated, labeled as a problem before anyone bothered to listen to what he was actually saying. He knew the song was something. He had known it for weeks. The hook had come to him almost fully formed, that relentless, repetitive, hypnotic loop that would go on to drive millions of people absolutely insane in the best possible way. But knowing you have a song and being able to record it are two very different things when you are sitting in a jail cell with no access to a studio. So XXXTentacion did what he had always done. He worked with what he had. The phone was old. The earbuds were cheap. The instrumental had to be played directly through the phone speaker because there was no way to properly route it into a recording setup. The audio quality was, by any professional standard, terrible. The conditions were impossible. Any producer or label executive looking at those circumstances would have said to wait, to be patient, to record it properly when the time came. XXXTentacion did not wait. The session lasted approximately 17 minutes. There was no warm-up. There was no multiple take philosophy where he carefully layered and adjusted and refined. He went in raw and he went in fast. The recording captured everything, the imperfections, the room sound, the slight distortion from the cheap equipment, the urgency in his voice that no amount of studio polish could ever have manufactured. That urgency was real because the circumstances were real. He was in jail. He did not know what his future looked like. And he was pouring all of that into 17 minutes of audio that he fully expected to disappear into the internet without a single person noticing. He uploaded it to SoundCloud from behind those bars. No announcement, no promotion, no team sending it to blogs and playlists and tastemakers. He uploaded it the same way he had uploaded everything before it, quietly, without ceremony, into the enormous ocean of music that the internet had become, where millions of songs went every single week, and the overwhelming majority of them were never heard by anyone outside the artist's immediate circle. He went back to his cell. He did not expect anything to happen. What happened instead was unlike almost anything the internet had seen in the way music spreads. Look at Me did not go viral slowly. It did not build gradually the way most songs do, finding an audience week by week, month by month. It ignited. The people who found it in those first hours played it and immediately sent it to someone else. Those people played it and sent it to someone else. The specific quality that made the song impossible to ignore was also the quality that made it impossible to keep to yourself. It demanded a reaction. It demanded that you share it with someone just to see the look on their face when they heard it for the first time. Within days, the numbers were moving in a way that made no sense on paper. This was a song recorded on a phone by a teenager in jail with no label behind it and no marketing budget and no industry connections pushing it forward. Songs like that were not supposed to move the way Look at Me was moving. The algorithms that governed SoundCloud and the other platforms were not built to predict something like this. There was no category for it. The people who worked in the music industry and first noticed the numbers reacted in one of two ways. Some of them were dismissive. They looked at the audio quality and the circumstances of the recording and concluded that this was a novelty, a curiosity, something that would spike and then disappear the moment the internet moved on to the next thing. They had seen songs go viral before. They had watched plenty of artists get a moment of attention that ultimately led nowhere. They were not impressed. The other group of people, the ones who actually listened closely, understood immediately that something different was happening, because the reaction to Look at Me was not the reaction to a novelty. The people who were sharing it were not sharing it because it was strange or because they found it amusing. They were sharing it because it hit something inside them that most music never reaches. There was a rawness to it, an authenticity that bypassed every defense and went straight to something primal. People who had never in their lives listened to anything that sounded like Look at Me were finding themselves unable to stop playing it. Inside Indian River County Jail, XXXTentacion had no real-time access to what was happening with his song. Information came to him in fragments, through conversations, through messages when he had access to communication. And what was coming back to him was impossible to process from inside a cell. The song was everywhere. People who had never heard his name 24 hours ago were now saying it constantly. Comment sections were flooding. Reposts were multiplying. Something that he had recorded in 17 minutes on a phone with a pair of cheap earbuds was behaving like a wildfire that nobody had any idea how to contain. The music industry does not like things it cannot explain. When something moves the way Look at Me was moving, without any of the traditional machinery behind it, the instinct of the industry is to immediately try to attach that machinery to it. Labels began making inquiries. Management companies began asking questions. The ecosystem of people who exist to attach themselves to rising artists began circling. All of this was happening while XXXTentacion was still locked up, still in that cell, still a teenager, still facing serious legal proceedings, still completely removed from the world that was suddenly learning his name. What is important to understand about XXXTentacion in this moment is that he was not surprised that the song was good. He had known it was good before he recorded it. What he had not fully believed, what none of his previous uploads had been able to make him believe despite growing numbers of followers and a dedicated, underground audience, was that good was enough. He had spent years putting music into the world and watching it find small pockets of listeners who connected with it deeply, but never the kind of explosion that changes everything. He had started to wonder, in the way that every artist wonders in their darkest moments, whether the thing standing between him and the world was not the quality of his work, but something else entirely, something unfixable, some fundamental gap between what he was making and what the world was ready to receive. Look at Me answered that question. The world was ready. It had always been ready. It was waiting for exactly what he was making, that specific collision of aggression and vulnerability, that sound that refused to fit into any existing box. That voice that could go from a whisper to a scream inside a single bar and make both feel completely inevitable. The months that followed his release from jail were unlike anything he had been prepared for. The underground audience that had been building for years was still there, still loyal, still deeply invested. But now there was a much larger audience sitting on top of it, people who had come in through Look at Me and stayed because every other song they found in his catalog was doing the same thing to them that Look at Me had done. The catalog was deep, he had been recording for years. There was so much to discover that new listeners felt like they were excavating something, finding a body of work that felt fully formed and fully realized in a way that was shocking given his age. And he released his debut studio album 17 in August of 27. The title was a reference to his age during the period when he had been in jail, when the seeds of everything on the album had been planted. It was not a hip-hop album in any traditional sense. It incorporated elements of rock, of alternative music, of soul, of spoken word. It ran for about 22 minutes and it felt less like a commercial product and more like a document of a specific, emotional, a transmission from somewhere very dark and very honest. It debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 chart. The teenager who had recorded Look at Me on a phone in a jail cell was now sitting at number 2 on the most prestigious album chart in the world. The industry that had been skeptical or dismissive was no longer either of those things. Labels were not just making inquiries now, they were competing aggressively. Management deals that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier were now on the table. The conversation around XXXTentacion had shifted completely. He was no longer being discussed as a viral phenomenon that might fade. He was being discussed as a generational voice, someone whose influence on the direction of music was already visible in the way younger artists were beginning to incorporate his aesthetic into their own work. But none of that changed who he was or where he had come from. The music he continued to make after Look at Me exploded did not become safer or more commercially calculated. It continued to go to the same places, the same dark corners, the same emotional extremes that had defined everything he had recorded before anyone was paying attention. The audience that came to him because of Look at Me learned quickly that what they had heard was not an exception. It was a window into something much larger and much more complex. In December of 2017, Look at Me was officially released as a single through a record label distribution deal. By that point, it had already been streaming for over a year and had accumulated numbers that most major label releases never reached. The official release pushed those numbers even further. The song that had been recorded in 17 minutes on a phone in a jail cell in 2016 was now certified platinum, then multi-platinum, then it kept climbing. There is something specific that Look at Me revealed about the nature of authenticity in music. The industry had spent decades building systems designed to manufacture authenticity, to take artists and shape them through careful production and marketing and image management into something that felt real to audiences. And those systems work to a point. They can create careers, they can generate hits, they can produce moments that resonate. But there is a ceiling to manufactured authenticity, a point at which audiences can sense the machinery underneath the performance, even if they cannot articulate what they are sensing. What Look at Me had was something that could not be manufactured. The imperfect audio quality was not a flaw, it was evidence. Evidence that the song had been made in a real place by a real person under real circumstances with no safety net and no plan and no guarantee that anyone would ever hear it. Every crack in the recording was proof that it was true, and audiences responded to that truth the way they always respond to truth when it is rare enough, with complete and overwhelming recognition. The jail cell where XXXTentacion recorded that song no longer exists in the form it did in 2016. The phone he used is gone, the earbuds are gone, the 17 minutes of the actual recording session are lost to time the way most real moments are, but the song survived. It is still being heard by new listeners every single day. Young people who were children in 2016 are discovering it now and having the same reaction that the first listeners had, that immediate, visceral, undeniable recognition that something real is happening. The story of Look at Me is not ultimately a story about a jail cell or a phone or a pair of earbuds. It is a story about what happens when an artist refuses to let circumstances determine what they are capable of. XXXTentacion had every reason to wait. He had every practical argument available to him for why the conditions were wrong, and the time was wrong, and the tools were wrong. He ignored all of it. He recorded the song because the song needed to be recorded, because waiting for perfect conditions is the most reliable way to ensure that the most important things never get made. He was 17 years old in that jail cell. He had no idea that what he was about to do in 17 minutes would change his life, would change the lives of the people who heard it, would change the conversation about what hip-hop could be and where it could go. He just had a song, and he recorded it. That is the whole story, and somehow that is enough. There is one more thing worth saying about what Look at Me meant in the larger context of where music was going in 2016 and 2017. The industry had been in a period of intense consolidation. The streaming revolution had already begun reshaping how music was distributed and consumed, but the gatekeeping structures had not fully collapsed yet. Major labels still controlled the majority of what received significant promotion and placement. Independent artists could find audiences on SoundCloud and YouTube and other platforms, but breaking through to the level of cultural conversation that Look at Me achieved without any institutional support was still considered essentially impossible. The accepted wisdom was that talent alone was not sufficient. You needed the machinery, you needed the infrastructure, you needed someone with power and resources to decide you were worth investing in before the world would decide you were worth listening to. XXXTentacion broke that accepted wisdom in a way that could not be explained away or dismissed as a lucky accident, because it was not luck. The song was extraordinary. The emotional intelligence embedded in that recording, the instinctive understanding of how to use space and silence and volume and rhythm to create a specific psychological experience in the listener, these were not qualities that appeared by chance in a 17-year-old recording on a cheap phone in a jail cell. They were the product of years of obsessive listening and obsessive making and obsessive refinement that had happened entirely outside the view of the industry that would later scramble to claim credit for discovering him. What the success of Look at Me proved, and what the subsequent arc of his career continued to prove, was that the audience for genuine emotional truth in music is essentially unlimited. People will find it. They will share it. They will refuse to let it stay quiet, no matter how little official support it has, no matter how unconventional its origins, no matter how uncomfortable the industry finds the artist making it. The machinery exists to amplify things that are already real. It cannot create the realness. It can only respond to it after the fact. XXXTentacion understood this intuitively in a way that many artists who have spent years inside the industry never fully grasp. He was not trying to make music that sounded like what was already succeeding. He was not studying the charts and reverse engineering the formula. He was making the music that was most true to what was happening inside him, and he was trusting that the truth would find its audience. The jail cell was not an obstacle to that process. In a strange way, it was the condition that made it possible, because it stripped away every distraction and left him alone with only the most essential thing, which was the song itself and the urgency to get it out of his head and into the world before the moment passed. Every artist who came after XXXTentacion and built a career by recording on a phone, by uploading to SoundCloud without a label, by bypassing the traditional gatekeepers and going directly to the audience, owes something to what happened in that cell in 2016, not because he invented the idea of independent distribution, but because he demonstrated at a scale that was impossible to ignore that the idea worked, that the audience was there, that the hunger for something real was enormous and unsatisfied, and waiting for someone with the courage and the conviction to feed it without asking permission first. The story ends as so many important stories do, not with a conclusion but with a door left open. XXXTentacion died on June 18, 2018 at the age of 20 years old. He was shot during a robbery in Deerfield Beach, Florida. He had been alive for just under 2.5 years since he uploaded Look at Me from inside Indian River County Jail. In that time he had released 2 studio albums, both of which debuted in the top 2 on the Billboard 200. He had accumulated streaming numbers that most artists spend entire decades trying to reach. He had changed the sound and the direction of an entire genre. He had built one of the most devoted and passionate fan bases in contemporary music history, and he had done all of it while still being, in most essential ways, the same teenager who had sat in that cell with a phone and a pair of earbuds and a song that would not leave him alone. The phone is gone. The earbuds are gone. The cell is just a cell again holding someone else's story now. But the 17 minutes survived. They are still there. They are still finding new ears every single day. And every time someone hears Look at Me for the first time and feels that immediate, undeniable recognition, that sense of something hitting them in a place that most music never reaches. They are experiencing what those first listeners experienced in the summer of 2016, the shock of encountering something completely real in a world that had learned to be very, very good at producing things that only looked like it.